Hi movie review lovers friends. Today I am going to describe the movie story of The Revenant. Now let's talk about it. As we know that The Revenant is a 2015 American epic Western action drama film directed by Alejandro González Iñárritu. The screenplay by Mark L. Smith and Iñárritu is based in part on Michael Punk's 2002 novel The Revenant, which describes frontiersman Hugh Glass's experiences in 1823. The film stars Leonardo DiCaprio as Glass, alongside Tom Hardy, Domhnall Gleeson, and Will Poulter. 6. In August 2001, Akiva Goldman purchased Punk's manuscript. Iñárritu signed on to direct The Revenant in August 2011. In April 2014, after several delays due to other projects, Iñárritu confirmed that he was beginning work on it and that DiCaprio had the lead role. Principal photography began in October 2014. Location and crew concerns delayed production from May to August 2015. The Revenant premiered at TCL Chinese Theater in Los Angeles, California, on December 16, 2015. It had a limited release on December 25 and a wide release on January 8, 2016 by 20th Century Fox. It was a blockbuster, grossing $533 million worldwide. It received critical acclaim, with praise for the performances, particularly for DiCaprio and Hardy, Iñárritu's direction, and Emmanuel Lubezki's cinematography. However, some criticism went to its runtime. 7, 8, 9. It won 3 Golden Globe Awards and 5 BAFTA Awards, including Best Film at both ceremonies. At the 88th Academy Awards, the film received 12 nominations, including Best Picture and Best Supporting Actor, Hardy. It won the Academy Awards for Best Director, Iñárritu, his second consecutive in that category. Best Actor, DiCaprio, his first after 5 previous nominations, and Best Cinematography, Emmanuel Lubezki, his third consecutive in that category. DiCaprio also won the Golden Globe Award, the Screen Actors Guild Award, the BAFTA Award, and the Critics' Choice Award for Best Actor. For trapper Hugh Glass watches as American soldiers burn down a Native American village on the Great Plains. Years later, in late 1823, during the Iroquois War, Glass guides Captain Andrew Henry's trappers through the unorganized territory of the present-day Dakotas. While he and his half-pony son, Hawk, are hunting, the company's camp is attacked by an Iroquois war party, which is seeking to recover its chief's abducted daughter, Powaka. Many of the trappers are killed during the fight, and the rest of them escape onto a flatboat. Guided by Glass, the survivors begin a trek to Fort Kiowa on foot because Glass believes traveling down the Missouri River will make them vulnerable. After docking, the crew stash their pelts near the shore. Some of the men continue the journey by boat, but are later intercepted and killed by the Iroquois. While scouting game, Glass is mauled and left nearly dead by a grizzly bear. Fearing another Iroquois attack, trapper John Fitzgerald argues that the group must mercy kill Glass and keep moving. Henry agrees, but he is unable to pull the trigger. Instead, he offers to pay anyone who will stay with Glass and bury him after he dies. When the only volunteers are Hawk and the young Jim Bridger, Fitzgerald, wanting the money to recoup his losses from the abandoned pelts, also agrees to stay. After the others leave, Fitzgerald attempts to smother Glass, but is stopped when Hawk intervenes. Fitzgerald stabs Hawk to death as Glass watches helplessly. The next morning, Fitzgerald convinces Bridger, who is unaware of Hawk's murder, that the Iroquois are approaching and they must abandon Glass. At first Bridger protests, but he ultimately follows Fitzgerald after the latter leaves Glass half buried alive in a makeshift grave. Bridger leaves behind a canteen on which he had engraved a spiral symbol. The next morning, Bridger forces Fitzgerald to admit that there are no pursuing Iroquois. They reach the fort, and Fitzgerald falsely reports to Henry that Hawk vanished and Glass died. Bridger is complicit in the lie about Glass's death, but remains unaware of Hawk's murder. Glass starts an arduous journey crawling through the wilderness, taking Bridger's canteen with him. He performs a crude cauterization of his wounds and eludes the pursuing Iroquois by jumping into river rapids. He encounters Pawnee refugee Haikuk, who tells Glass that revenge is in the Creator's hands. The men share bison meat and travel together. As a storm approaches, Hickok constructs a sweat lodge for the feverish Glass to shelter in. After a hallucinogenic experience in the lodge, Glass emerges to discover that French-Canadian hunters have lynched Hickok. Glass infiltrates the hunters' camp and sees their leader, Toussaint, raping Puwaka. Glass frees her. With a knife provided by Glass, she threatens Toussaint with castration to silence him from alerting the other Frenchmen, and then flees while Glass kills several hunters and recovers Hickok's horse, leaving Bridger's canteen behind. The following day, Glass is ambushed by the Arikara and drives over a cliff on his horse as he escapes their pursuit, landing on a pine tree that cushions his fall. He survives the night by disemboweling the dead horse and sheltering nude inside its carcass. A French survivor staggers into Fort Kiowa, and Bridger recognizes the man's spiral-engraved canteen. Believing that it was stolen from Hawke, Henry organizes a search party. Fitzgerald, realizing that Glass is alive, empties the outpost's safe and flees, intending to reach Texas. The search party finds the exhausted Glass. Furious, Henry orders the arrest of Bridger upon returning to the fort, but Glass vouches for him, saying Bridger was deceived by Fitzgerald, who had murdered Hawke. Glass and Henry set out in pursuit of Fitzgerald. After the two men split up, Fitzgerald ambushes, kills, and scalps Henry. Glass props up Henry's corpse on his horse to act as a decoy, taking its place himself to ambush Fitzgerald and shooting him in the shoulder. He pursues Fitzgerald to a riverbank, where they engage in a brutal fight. Glass is about to kill Fitzgerald, but he spots a band of Arikara downstream. He remembers Hickok's words and pushes Fitzgerald downstream into the hands of the Arikara. Their chief, Elk Dog, kills Fitzgerald by stabbing him in the head and then scalps him and the Arikara, who have found Puwaka. Spare Glass. Glass retreats into the mountains, where he is visited by his wife's spirit. Cast: Leonardo DiCaprio as Hugh Glass, Tom Hardy as John S. Fitzgerald, Domhnall Gleeson as Andrew Henry, Will Poulter as Jim Bridger, Forrest Goodluck as Hawke, Paul Anderson as Anderson, Christopher Jonah as Murphy, Dwayne Howard as Elk Dog, Milan Nakeko as Puwaka, Arthur Redcloud as Hickok, Lucas Haas as Jones, Brendan Fletcher as Fryman, Tom Gyrie as Billy Brother Trapper, Grace Dove as Hugh Glass's wife, Fabrice Atta as Toussaint. Production. Development. Director Alejandro G. Inarritu. Development of The Revenant began in August 2001, with producer Akiva Goldsman acquiring the rights to Michael Pump's then unpublished manuscript. 10. David Rabe had written the film's script. 11. The production was picked up by Park Chan-wook, with Samuel L. Jackson in mind to star. Park later left the project. 12. 13. The development stalled until 2010 when Mark L. Smith wrote a new adaptation of the novel for Steve Golan's anonymous content. In May 2010, Smith revealed that John Hillcoat was attached to direct the film and that Christian Bale was in negotiation to star. 14. Hillcoat left the project in October 2010. 13. Jean-Francois Richet was considered to replace Hen, but Alejandro G. Inarritu signed on to direct in August 2011. 13. 15. Goldman was also confirmed to be producing with Weed Road Pictures. 15. In November, New Regency Productions joined to produce with anonymous content, and 20th Century Fox was confirmed to be distributing the film. 16. 17 days later, Inarritu stated that he was seeking Leonardo DiCaprio and Sean Penn for the two lead roles. 18. Once Inarritu agreed to direct, he began working with Smith on script rewrites. In an interview with Creative Screenwriting, Smith admitted that during this process, he was unsure if Inarritu would even be able to film some of the sequences they wrote. He recalled, "He would have some ideas and I would say, 'Alejandro, we can't pull this off. It's not going to work,' and he would say, 'Mark, trust me, we can do this.' In the end, he was right." 19. The project was put on hold in March 2012, as New Regency hired Inarritu to direct an adaptation of Flim Flam Man, Jennifer Vogel's nonfiction book about her criminal father. 20. Penn was also under consideration for the lead role in that film. 21. In December 2012, Inarritu announced that his next film would be Birdman, or The Unexpected Virtue of Ignorance, a comedy drama about an actor who once played a famous superhero. He ended up winning the Academy Awards for Best Director and Best Original Screenplay, with the film winning Best Picture. Filming took place in March 2013. 22. The Revenant was scheduled to begin production right after Birdman wrapped. 23. A production budget of $60 million was granted, with $30 million funded by New Regency. Brett Ratner's Rat Pack Dune Entertainment, a joint venture between Ratner's Rat Pack Entertainment and Fox's former financing partner, Dune Entertainment, also funded the film. 16. Worldview Entertainment, which also co-financed Birdman, was originally set to fund the film but backed out in July 2014 due to the departure of CEO Christopher Woodrow. 16. 23. 24. New Regency approached Fox for additional funding, but Fox declined, citing the pay-or-play contracts made for both DiCaprio and Tom Hardy, which would require that the actors be paid regardless of whether the film is completed. 24. Annapurna Pictures' Megan Ellison entered negotiations to finance the film shortly after. 16. 24. The Chinese company Guangdong Alpha Animation and Culture Company partially financed the film. 25. Filming. Principal photography for The Revenant began in October 2014. 26. A planned 2-week break from filming in December was extended to 6 weeks, which forced Tom Hardy to drop out of Suicide Squad. In February 2015, Inarritu, who shot the film using natural lighting, stated that production would last until the end of April or May, as the crew is shooting in such remote, faraway locations that, by the time we arrive and have to return, we have already spent 40% of the day. 27, 28, 29. Ultimately, principal photography wrapped in August 2015. Citation needed. The waterfall scenes were filmed at the Kootenay Falls near Libby, Montana. Though the initial plan was to film the last scenes in Canada, the weather was ultimately too warm, leading the filmmakers to locations near the Rio Olivia in Tierra del Fuego, Argentina, with snow on the ground, to shoot the ending. Crew members often complained about difficult filming, with many quitting or being fired. Mary Parent was then brought in as a producer. 26. Inarritu stated that some of the crew members had left the production, explaining that, as a director, if I identify a violin that is out of tune, I have to take that from the orchestra. On his experience, DiCaprio stated, I can name 30 or 40 sequences that were some of the most difficult things I've ever had to do. Whether it's going in and out of frozen rivers, or sleeping in animal carcasses, or what I ate on set. I was enduring freezing cold and possible hypothermia constantly. 31, 32. Hardy lightly wrestled Inarritu on set to release tension while during filming. 33. Inarritu had stated that he originally wanted to film chronologically, a process that would have added $7 million to the production budget. 34. Later he confirmed that it was shot in sequence, though Hardy had stated that it was impossible due to weather conditions. 35, 36. The terrain of the filming locations was not true to the actual Hugh Glass mauling story, which really occurred in modern-day South Dakota. In July 2015, it was reported that the budget had ballooned from the original $60 million to $95 million, and by the time production wrapped it had reached $135 million. 3. Visual effects. The visual effects were produced primarily by Industrial Light and Magic, ILM. Other companies, such as Moving Picture Company, MPC, and Cinesite, also created visual effects. 37. The musical score was composed by Japanese musician Ryuichi Sakamoto and German electronic musician Alva Noto, with additional music composed by Bryce Dessner. 38. The main body of the score was recorded at the Seattle Music Scoring Stage in the Baxter Chapel in Greater Seattle, Washington by musicians of the Northwest Sinfonia. Sakamoto conducted these sessions. Bryce Dessner's portion of the score was performed by the 25-piece Berlin-based orchestra known as STARGAZE under conductor André de Ritter. 39-40. Additional licensed music includes Become Ocean, The Pulitzer Prize and Grammy Award-winning work of John Luther Adams as recorded by the Seattle Symphony with conductor Ludovic Morlet, and an excerpt of Jet Sun Mila from French musician and composer Alain Radic, 41. A soundtrack album was released online on December 25, 2015, and on CD on January 8, 2016. Milan Records released a vinyl pressing of the soundtrack in April 2016, 40. The score by Sakamoto and Noto was ruled ineligible for the Academy Award for Best Original Score at the 2016 Oscars, as it was deemed that it was assembled from the music of more than one composer. 42. Documentary. The movie was accompanied by a 44-minute documentary named A World Unseen, highlighting the process of making the production. A World Unseen was released on January 21, 2016 on YouTube. 43-44. Elliot Roche served as its director. 45-46. Themes. In the Los Angeles Review of Books, critic Y.G. Dimmock compared the Revenant's themes with those addressed in the literary works of James Fenimore Cooper, particularly The Last of the Mohicans. Dimmock argues that the film reinterprets the concept of half-breeds from a derogatory idea that Cooper despised to an aesthetic way in which to see the world. She compared both works' protagonists, Glass and Hawkeye, as literary foils, with Glass living an inversion of the latter's biography and perspective. 47. In the documentary A World Unseen, the director stated that for the Revenant's main themes, he revisits the issues and concerns of intense parental and filial relations, which are readily recognizable as a recurrent theme from his previous works. Regarding the theme of revenge, he mentioned that the approach of vengeance in the film needs to be significantly tempered by anyone who would want to see vengeance as either an effective or useful moral to be applied in life. In the end, he said, there can only be a disappointment and lack of fulfillment for anyone who looks to revenge as providing a higher purpose for living or a life-defining purpose. Historical accuracy. Cheyenne River Indian Reservation is in South Dakota. Glass's survival journey did not take place in the cold season, nor did it involve tall mountain ranges. The Guardian reported, the backstory about Glass's love for a punny woman is fiction. It has been suggested the real Glass had such a relationship, but there's no firm evidence, and no evidence that he had any children. As for the ending, it has been changed in one significant way. In real life, nobody got killed. 48. Canadian actor Roy Dupuis was strongly critical of the portrayal of French-Canadian voyageurs as murderous rapists. Dupuis was originally offered a role as a voyageur, but he rejected it due to perceptions of anti-French bias and historical inaccuracies. 49, 50, 51, 52, according to Alan Greer, the Canada Research Chair of Colonial North America. Generally, the American traders had a worse reputation than the Canadians. 49. The filmmakers made a special point of emphasizing the importance of historical issues of ethnicity approached in the movie and represented in the mixed ethnic background of Hugh Glass's son portrayed in the film, portrayed as half punny by Glass's wife, as relating to his own life and his identification with ethnic concerns. The director has referred to having encountered constant xenophobia and stated that these constant and relentless xenophobic comments have been widely spread by the media without shame, embraced and cheered by leaders and communities around the U.S. The foundation of all this is so outrageous that it can easily be minimized as an SNL sketch, a mere entertainment, a joke. I debated with myself if I should bring up this uncomfortable subject tonight, but in light of the constant and relentless xenophobic comments that have been expressed recently against my Mexican fellows, it is inevitable. 53. Bruce Broadley of True West magazine pointed out several anachronisms hinted in the film, such as John Fitzgerald talking about his father having friends in the Texas Rangers, and about going to Texas and joining the Army himself. However, in 1823, Texas was still part of Mexico and therefore would not have had an American army, let alone the Texas Rangers. Another anachronism involved Hugh Glass discovering a mountain of buffalo skulls while working his way to Fort Kiowa, despite the buffalo slaughter not occurring until the 1870s. 54. Native American culture. To portray Arikara culture accurately, The filmmakers hired several cultural consultants, 55, 56, and teamed up with 2 linguists to provide faithful Arikara and Pawnee language lines for actors, 57, 58. Hickok. The Pawnee man who helps Glass survive is played by a Navajo actor, 59. However, in one scene, a Pawnee character rescuing Glass is accompanied by a voiceover in Inupiaq, which is spoken in Arctic Alaska, thousands of kilometers away, and a different language family from Pawnee. The voiceover was a recording of Dory Newtak Simmons, 60, reading a poem from a John Luther Adams recording. The words originally came from an Inuk woman named Yuvavnuk, an Angakik, shaman, and oral poet, 61. Release. The Revenant had a limited release in the United States on December 25, 2015, including Los Angeles, making it eligible for the 88th Academy Awards before being released nationwide on January 8, 2016, 62-63. The film opened in Australia on January 7, 2016, and in the United Kingdom on January 15, 2016, 64-65 in the Philippines. The film's release date was originally set for January 27, 2016, but it was eventually delayed 1 week to February 3, 2016, 66-67, although studios initially chose not to pursue a theatrical release in China. Following its 3 wins at the 88th Academy Awards on February 28, 2016, the film was granted a release in China but with several cuts, 68. It was released on March 18, 2016, 25. Home media. The DVD, Blu-ray and 4K Ultra HD Blu-ray were released on April 12, 2016, in the US, 69. Opening sales of the DVD along with online streaming orders placed The Revenant as number 1 in sales at Amazon. 70. Distribution to major rental outlets in the US was done on May 17, 2016. Piracy. On December 20, 2015, less than 1 week before its release, screener copies of The Revenant were leaked online. The FBI linked this to Alcon Entertainment CEO Andrew Kosov, who denied responsibility. 71. In October 2016, a former 20th Century Fox employee was fined $1.12 million in a separate case for uploading both The Revenant and the Peanuts movie online. 72. Reception. Box office. The Revenant grossed $183.6 million in the United States and Canada and $349.3 million in other countries for a worldwide total of $533 million, against a production budget of $135 million. In March 2016, before the film had completed its theatrical domestic and international runs, Deadline Hollywood calculated the net profit of the film to be $61.6 million when factoring together all expenses and revenues. 73. In North America, The Revenant opened in limited release on December 25, 2015, and over the weekend grossed $474,560 from 4 theaters in New York City and Los Angeles, $118,640 per screen, finishing 23rd at the box office. 74. It was the second biggest theater average of 2015, behind the $130,000 four-screen debut of Steve Jobs. 75. The film earned a total of $1.6 million from its 2-week limited run before expanding wide on January 8, 2016, across 3,371 theaters. 76. 77. It earned $2.3 million from its early Thursday preview showings from 2,510 theaters. 76. On its opening day, the film earned $14.4 million, ranking first at the box office. 78. The film grossed $39.8 million in its opening weekend from 3,375 theaters, exceeding initial projections by 70% and finishing second at the box office behind Star Wars: The Force Awakens, $42.4 million, which was on its 4th weekend of play. It was the director's biggest opening of all time, and the 4th biggest for DiCaprio and supporting actor Tom Hardy. 79. Critics noted that The Force Awakens had an advantage from playing at 781 more theaters, family-friendly Sunday matinees, and all North American IMAX theaters, 79. Nevertheless, The Revenant played very balanced across the U.S. and overperformed in all states except the Northeast region, 79. Its wide release weekend is among the top openings in January, 80. It topped the box office in its fifth weekend overall and third weekend in wide release after competing with Ride Along 2 in its second weekend. It added $16 million in its third weekend, which was down 49.7%, but topped the box office, despite a blizzard blanketing most of the East Coast, which reportedly hurt many films' box office performance, 81-82, 83-84. The following weekend it was overtaken by Fox's own animated movie Kung Fu Panda 3, thereby topping the box office for one weekend, 85, following the announcement of the Oscar nominees on January 14th. The Revenant witnessed the biggest boost among the Best Picture category, jumping from $54.1 million to $170.5 million, an increase of plus 215% up to the Oscar ceremony in the weekend ending February 28, 86. Outside North America, the film secured a release in 78 countries. 87. It made $20.5 million from 2,407 screens in just 18 markets, placing behind The Force Awakens at the international box office chart and first among newly released films. 88. The following weekend, it added $32.3 million from 25 markets on 4,849 screens. 87. The film topped the international box office in its third weekend, the same weekend when it topped the U.S. box office, overtaking The Force Awakens with $33.7 million from 48 markets. 89. In the United Kingdom and Ireland, it took the number one spot with $7.87 million or £5.2 million, $7.4 million, from 589 theaters and remained there for a second weekend, declining by 24% with £3.86 million, $5.5 million, and for a third weekend, 87, 90, 91, 92, 93. Similarly, in Russia, it passed The Force Awakens to take the top spot with $7.5 million from 1,063 screens. 88. In France, it has the biggest opening day in Paris and the third biggest opening weekend of 2016 with $8.2 million. 94. It also opened at number 1 in Mexico, $5.1 million, Spain, $4 million, the Netherlands, $1.3 million, Belgium, $1.1 million, Argentina, $955,000, Sweden, $914,000, South Korea, Denmark, Norway, Israel, Egypt, and Portugal, among other markets. 87, 89, 92, 95, in Germany, $4.6 million, and Australia, $2.9 million. It debuted at number 2 both behind The Force Awakens and in Brazil, $2.17 million, behind The Ten Commandments. 88, 95. It had one of the top 10 openings of all time for a Fox film, not accounting for inflation in South Korea, with $5.7 million, and went on to top the box office there for a second weekend with $3.22 million, despite cold weather affecting theater attendance, resulting in low box office performance. 96, 97. In Russia, though not opening at number 1, it topped the box office in its second weekend with $4.4 million, more than The Force Awakens, and went on to the top for a third weekend with $3.60 million. 87, 98. In China, it had an opening day of around $11 million from more than 11,000 screens, including $250,000 in midnight previews and $23 million in 2 days. 99, 100, 101. In its opening weekend, it grossed $31 million, coming in second place behind the animated Zootopia. IMAX comprised $2.3 million on 278 screens, 102. In terms of total earnings, its largest markets outside of the US and Canada are China, $58.6 million, the United Kingdom, $32.8 million, Germany, $28.7 million, and France, $28.2 million. 103, 104. The film opened in Japan on March 23, 94, 105. Critical response. On Rotten Tomatoes, the film has an approval rating of 78% based on 401 reviews, with an average rating of 7.80/10. The website's critical consensus reads, "As starkly beautiful as it is harshly uncompromising, The Revenant uses Leonardo DiCaprio's committed performance as fuel for an absorbing drama that offers punishing challenges and rich rewards." 106. On Metacritic, the film has a weighted average score of 76 out of 100, based on 50 critics, indicating generally favorable reviews. 107. Audiences polled by CinemaScore gave the film an average grade of B+ on an A+ to F scale, and post-track reported audiences gave it an overall positive score of 85% and a 59% definite recommend. 108. 109. The performances of Leonardo DiCaprio and Tom Hardy garnered widespread critical acclaim, earning them Academy Award nominations for Best Actor and Best Supporting Actor respectively, with DiCaprio winning his category, marking his first Oscar win. Reviewers cited in a CBS News survey of critics highly praised DiCaprio's performance, referring to it as an astonishing testament to his commitment to a role and as an anchoring performance of ferocious 200% commitment. 8. Peter Travers of Rolling Stone called DiCaprio's acting a virtuoso performance, thrilling in its brute force and silent eloquence. 110. Writing for Vulture, David Edelstein called the film a tour de force and bleak as hell but considerably more beautiful, but noted it had traditional masculinity instead of a search for what illuminates man's inhumanity to man. Citation needed. Justin Chang of Variety wrote Inari 2. Increasingly succumbs to the air of grim overdetermination that has marred much of his past work, and it was an imposing vision, but also an inflated and emotionally stunted one. 8. Stephanie Zacharek, writing for Time magazine, gave a positive review to the film stating, "Inarritu may have fashioned The Revenant as the ultimate endurance test, but as Glass, DiCaprio simply endures. He gives the movie a beating heart, offering it up, figuratively speaking, alive and bloody on a platter. He is the most visceral effect in the movie, revenge served warm. Bon appetit." 7. Richard Brody of The New Yorker was critical of the film, and said that Emmanuel Lubezki's images were mere pictorial ornament, to Alejandro G. Inarritu's bland theatrical stagings. 111. A critic for Santa Barbara Independent considered it a remake of Man in the Wilderness, 1971. 112. The Revenant was ranked 22nd on Metacritic's and 79th on Rotten Tomatoes list of best films of 2015, 113, 114, 115. Accolades. Main article. List of accolades received by The Revenant. Leonardo DiCaprio's performance was widely acclaimed and ultimately won him the Academy Award for Best Actor, the first of his career after 5 previous nominations. The Revenant has received numerous award nominations and wins, particularly for DiCaprio's performance, Inarritu's direction, and Lubezki's cinematography. At the 88th Annual Academy Awards, Inarritu won Best Director for the second consecutive time, Emmanuel Lubezki won Best Cinematography for the third consecutive time, and DiCaprio won his first award for Best Actor. Hardy lost the award for Best Supporting Actor to Mark Rylance for Bridge of Spies, and the film itself lost Best Picture to Spotlight, 116. At the 73rd Golden Globe Awards, it won 3 awards: Best Motion Picture, Drama, Best Director, and Best Actor, Drama. It also had a nomination for Best Original Score, 117. On January 14, 2016, the film received 12 Academy Award nominations, more than any other film at the ceremony, including Best Picture and Best Director, as well as Best Actor and Best Supporting Actor, 118, on February 14, 2016. The film received the most awards at 69th British Academy Film Awards out of 8 nominations, with 5, including Best Film, Best Director, Best Cinematography, Best Sound, and Best Leading Actor. 119. It received 9 Critics' Choice Awards nominations, winning 2 Best Actor and Best Cinematography. 120. Tom Hardy won the Best British Actor Award at the London Film Critics Circle and was runner-up for Best Supporting Actor at Dallas, Fort Worth Film Critics Association. 121. 122. DiCaprio was awarded Outstanding Performance by a Male Actor in a Leading Role Award at 22nd Screen Actors Guild Awards, and Inarritu received Outstanding Directing Feature Film Award at 68th Directors Guild of America Awards. 123. It received 5 Satellite Awards nominations, winning the award of Best Actor for DiCaprio. 124. On May 2, 2016, Time magazine included both DiCaprio and Inarritu in its issue of the 100 Most Influential People of 2015, with a cover photograph of DiCaprio on the magazine. John Kerry, then the U.S. Secretary of State, wrote a short testimonial to DiCaprio for this issue of Time, stating that DiCaprio's dedication drives him to succeed, and that's how he takes himself back 200 years to create an Oscar-winning, bear-brawling, powerhouse performance in The Revenant. 125. In July 2025, it was one of the films voted for the Reader's Choice edition of the New York Times list of the 100 best movies of the 21st century, finishing at number 271. The Western is a film genre defined by the American Film Institute as films which are set in the American West that embody the spirit, the struggle, and the demise of the new frontier. 1. Generally set in the American frontier between the California Gold Rush of 1849 and the closing of the frontier in 1892. 557. The genre also includes many examples of stories set in locations outside the frontier, including northern Mexico, the northwestern United States, Alaska, and western Canada, as well as stories that take place before 1849 and after 1890. Western films comprise part of the larger Western genre, which encompasses literature, music, television, and plastic arts. Western films derive from the Wild West shows that began in the 1870s. 348, originally referred to as Wild West dramas, the shortened term Western came to describe the genre. 4. Although other Western films were made earlier, The Great Train Robbery, 1903, is often considered to mark the beginning of the genre. 5. Westerns were a major genre during the silent era, 1894 to 1929. And continued to grow in popularity during the sound era, post-1929. The genre reached its pinnacle between 1945 and 1965, when it made up roughly a quarter of studio output. 6. The advent of color and widescreen during this era opened up new possibilities for directors to portray the vastness of the American landscape. 3. 105. This era also produced the genre's most iconic figures, including John Wayne and Randolph Scott, who developed personae that they maintained across most of their films. 7. Director John Ford is often considered one of the genre's greatest filmmakers. 8. With the proliferation of television in the 1960s, television westerns began to supersede film westerns in popularity. 9. By the end of the decade, studios had mostly ceased to make westerns. Despite their dwindling popularity during this decade, the 1960s gave rise to the revisionist western, several examples of which became vital entries in the canon. 10. Since the 1960s, new western films have only appeared sporadically. Despite their decreased prominence, western films remain an integral part of American culture and national mythology. 11. 12. Characteristics. Gary Cooper in Veracruz from 1954. The American Film Institute defines Western films as those set in the American West that embody the spirit, the struggle, and the demise of the new frontier. 1. The term Western, used to describe a narrative film genre, appears to have originated with a July 1912 article in Motion Picture World magazine. 13. Most of the characteristics of Western films were part of 19th century popular Western fiction and were firmly in place before film became a popular art form. 14. Page needed. Film critic Philip French has said that the Western is a commercial formula with rules as fixed and immutable as the kabuki theater. 1512. Western films commonly feature protagonists such as sheriffs, cowboys, gunslingers, and bounty hunters, who are often depicted as semi-nomadic wanderers who wear Stetson hats, bandanas, spurs, and buckskins, use revolvers or rifles as everyday tools of survival and as a means to settle disputes using frontier justice. Protagonists ride between dusty towns and cattle ranches on their trusty steeds. 16. History. Origins. Film westerns derive from the Wild West shows that began in the 1870s. 348. These shows, which included stage plays and outdoor exhibitions, culminated in Buffalo Bill's Wild West, a touring performance that ran from 1883 to 1913. Wild West shows, which were intended for urban audiences, established many of the elements that came to define Western films, such as the blending of fact and fiction and the romanticization of the frontier. 17. These early films were originally referred to as Wild West dramas. The term Western came to describe the genre. The use of this shortened term appears to have originated with a July 1912 article in Motion Picture World magazine. 4. The first films that belong to the Western genre are a series of short single-reel silents made in 1894 by Edison Studios at their Black Maria studio in West Orange, New Jersey. These featured veterans of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show exhibiting skills acquired by living in the Old West. They included Annie Oakley, shooting, and members of the Sioux, dancing. 18. Silent era. Western films were enormously popular in the silent film era, 1894 to 1927. The earliest known Western narrative film is the British short Kidnapping by Indians, made by Mitchell and Kenyon in Blackburn, England, in 1899. 1920. The Great Train Robbery, 1903. Based on the earlier British film A Daring Daylight Burglary, Edwin S. Porter's film starring Bronco Billy Anderson is often erroneously cited as the first Western, though George N. Fenton and William K. Everson point out that the Edison Company had played with Western material for several years prior to the Great Train Robbery. Nonetheless, they concur that Porter's film set the pattern of crime, pursuit, and retribution for the Western film as a genre. 21. The film's popularity opened the door for Anderson to become the screen's first Western star. He made several hundred Western film shorts. So popular was the genre that he soon faced competition from Tom Mix and William S. Hart. 22. Jesse James Under the Black Flag, 1921, was an early full-length silent feature Western starring Jesse James Jr. as his father. 1930s. With the advent of sound in 1927 to 28, the major Hollywood studios rapidly abandoned Westerns. 23, leaving the genre to smaller studios and producers. These smaller organizations churned out countless low-budget features and serials in the 1930s. By the late 1930s, the Western film was widely regarded as a pulp genre in Hollywood, but its popularity was dramatically revived in 1939 by major studio productions such as Dodge City starring Errol Flynn, Jesse James with Tyrone Power, Union Pacific with Joel McCrea, Destry Rides Again featuring James Stewart and Marlena Dietrich, and especially John Ford's landmark Western adventure Stagecoach starring John Wayne, which became one of the biggest hits of the year. Released through United Artists, Stagecoach made John Wayne a mainstream screen star in the wake of a decade of headlining B-Westerns. Wayne had been introduced to the screen 10 years earlier as the leading man in director Roel Walsh's spectacular widescreen The Big Trail, which failed at the box office in spite of being shot on location across the American West, including the Grand Canyon, Yosemite, and the giant redwoods, due in part to exhibitors' inability to switch over to widescreen during the Great Depression. The American frontier, also known as the Old West and popularly known as the Wild West, encompasses the geography, history, folklore, and culture associated with the forward wave of American expansion in mainland North America that began with European colonial settlements in the early 17th century and ended with the admission of the last few contiguous Western territories as states in 1912. This era of massive migration and settlement was particularly encouraged by President Thomas Jefferson following the Louisiana Purchase, giving rise to the expansionist attitude known as Manifest Destiny and historians' frontier thesis. The legends, historical events, and folklore of the American frontier, known as the frontier myth, have embedded themselves into United States culture so much so that the Old West, and the Western genre of media specifically, has become one of the defining features of American national identity. 8. Periodization. Historians have debated at length as to when the frontier era began, when it ended, and which were its key subperiods. 3. For example, the Old West subperiod is sometimes used by historians regarding the time from the end of the American Civil War in 1865 to when the Superintendent of the Census, William Rush Merriam, stated that the U.S. Census Bureau would stop recording Western frontier settlement as part of its census categories after the 1890 U.S. Census. 9, 10, 11, 12. His successors, however, continued the practice until the 1920 census. 1, 2. Others, including the Library of Congress and the University of Oxford, often cite differing points reaching into the early 1900s, typically within the first 2 decades before American entry into World War I. 4, 13. A period known as the Western Civil War of Incorporation lasted from the 1850s to 1919. This period includes historical events synonymous with the archetypical Old West or Wild West, such as violent conflict arising from encroaching settlement into frontier land, the removal and assimilation of natives, consolidation of property to large corporations and government, vigilantism, and the attempted enforcement of laws upon outlaws. 14. In 1890, the Superintendent of the Census, William Rush Merriam, stated, up to and including 1880, the country had a frontier of land. But at present the unsettled area has been so broken into by isolated bodies of settlement that there can hardly be said to be a frontier line. In the discussion of its extent, its westward movement, etc., it cannot, therefore, any longer have a place in the census reports. 15. Despite this, the later 1900 U.S. Census continued to show the westward frontier line, and his successors continued the practice. 116. By the 1910 U.S. Census, however, the frontier had shrunk into divided areas without a singular westward line of settlement. 17. An influx of agricultural homesteaders in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, taking up more acreage than homestead grants in the entirety of the 19th century, is cited to have significantly reduced open land. 18. A frontier is a zone of contact at the edge of a line of settlement. Theorist Frederick Jackson Turner argued that the frontier was the scene of a defining process of American civilization. The frontier, he asserted, promoted the formation of a composite nationality for the American people. He theorized it was a process of development, this perennial rebirth, this fluidity of American life, this expansion westward, furnish, the forces dominating American character. 19. Turner's ideas since 1893 have inspired generations of historians and critics to explore multiple individual American frontiers. But the popular folk frontier concentrates on the conquest and settlement of Native American lands west of the Mississippi River, in what is now the Midwest, Texas, the Great Plains, the Rocky Mountains, the Southwest, and the West Coast. 20. Enormous popular attention was focused on the western United States, especially the Southwest, in the second half of the 19th century and the early 20th century, from the 1850s to the 1910s. Such media typically exaggerated the romance, anarchy, and chaotic violence of the period for greater dramatic effect. This inspired the Western genre of film, along with television shows, novels, comic books, video games, children's toys, and costumes. As defined by Hine and Faragher, frontier history tells the story of the creation and defense of communities, the use of the land, the development of crops and hotels, and the formation of states. They explain, it is a tale of conquest, but also one of survival, persistence, and the merging of peoples and cultures that gave birth and continuing life to America. 21. Turner himself repeatedly emphasized how the availability of free land to start new farms attracted pioneering Americans. The existence of an area of free land, its continuous recession, and the advance of American settlement westward explain American development. 22. Through treaties with foreign nations and native tribes, political compromise, military conquest, the establishment of law and order, the building of farms, ranches, and towns, the marking of trails and digging of mines. Combined with successive waves of immigrants moving into the region, the United States expanded from coast to coast, fulfilling the ideology of manifest destiny. In his Frontier Thesis 1893, Turner theorized that the frontier was a process that transformed Europeans into a new people, the Americans, whose values focused on equality, democracy, and optimism, as well as individualism, self-reliance, and even violence. 23. Terms West and Frontier. U.S. Census map showing the extent of settlement and frontier line in 1900. The frontier is the margin of undeveloped territory that would comprise the United States beyond the established frontier line. 24-25. The U.S. Census Bureau designated frontier territory as generally unoccupied land with a population density of fewer than 2 people per square mile, 0.77 people per square kilometer. The frontier line was the outer boundary of European American settlement into this land. 26-27. Beginning with the first permanent European settlements on the East Coast, it has moved steadily westward from the 1600s to the 1900s decades, with occasional movements north into Maine and New Hampshire, south into Florida, and east from California into Nevada. Pockets of settlements would also appear far past the established frontier line, particularly on the West Coast and the deep interior, with settlements such as Los Angeles and Salt Lake City respectively. The West was the recently settled area near that boundary. 28. Thus, parts of the Midwest and American South, though no longer considered Western, have a frontier heritage along with the modern Western states. 29-30. Richard W. Slaughter, in his view of the frontier, writes that historians sometimes define the American West as lands west of the 98th meridian or 98 degrees west longitude, and that other definitions of the region include all lands west of the Mississippi or Missouri rivers. In the colonial era, before 1776, the West was of high priority for settlers and politicians. The American frontier began when Jamestown, Virginia, was settled by the English in 1607. In the earliest days of European settlement on the Atlantic coast, until about 1680, the frontier was essentially any part of the interior of the continent beyond the fringe of existing settlements along the Atlantic coast. 32. English, French, Spanish, and Dutch patterns of expansion and settlement were quite different. Only a few thousand French migrated to Canada. These habitants settled in villages along the St. Lawrence River, building communities that remained stable for long stretches. Although French fur traders ranged widely through the Great Lakes and Midwest region, they seldom settled down. French settlement was limited to a few very small villages, such as Kaskaskia, Illinois, 33, as well as a larger settlement around New Orleans. In what is now New York State, the Dutch set up for trading posts in the Hudson River Valley, followed by large grants of land to rich landowning patroons who brought in tenant farmers who created compact, permanent villages. They created a dense rural settlement in upstate New York, but they did not push westward. 34. Areas in the north that were in the frontier stage by 1700 generally had poor transportation facilities, so the opportunity for commercial agriculture was low. These areas remained primarily in subsistence agriculture, and as a result, by the 1760s these societies were highly egalitarian, as explained by historian Jackson Turner Maine. The typical frontier society, therefore, was one in which class distinctions were minimized. The wealthy speculator, if one was involved, usually remained at home so that ordinarily no one of wealth was a resident. The class of landless poor was small. The great majority were landowners, most of whom were also poor because they were starting with little property and had not yet cleared much land, nor had they acquired the farm tools and animals which would one day make them prosperous. Few artisans settled on the frontier except for those who practiced a trade to supplement their primary occupation of farming. There might be a storekeeper, a minister, and perhaps a doctor, and there were several landless laborers. All the rest were farmers. 35. In the South, frontier areas that lacked transportation, such as the Appalachian Mountains region, remained based on subsistence farming and resembled the egalitarianism of their northern counterparts, although they had a larger upper class of slave owners. North Carolina was representative. However, frontier areas of 1700 that had good river connections were increasingly transformed into plantation agriculture. Rich men came in, bought up the good land, and worked it with slaves. The area was no longer frontier. It had a stratified society comprising a powerful upper-class white landowning gentry, a small middle class, a fairly large group of landless or tenant white farmers, and a growing slave population at the bottom of the social pyramid. Unlike the North, where small towns and even cities were common, the South was overwhelmingly rural. 36. From British peasants to American farmers. The seaboard colonial settlements gave priority to land ownership for individual farmers, and as the population grew, they pushed westward for fresh farmland. 37. Unlike Britain, where a small number of landlords owned most of the land, ownership in America was cheap, easy, and widespread. Land ownership brought a degree of independence, as well as a vote for local and provincial offices. The typical New England settlements were quite compact and small, under a square mile. Conflict with the Native Americans arose out of political issues, namely who would rule. 38. Early frontier areas east of the Appalachian Mountains included the Connecticut River Valley, 39, and northern New England, which was a move to the north, not the west. 40. Wars with French and with natives. Siege of Fort Detroit during Pontiac's War in 1763. Settlers on the frontier often connected isolated incidents to indicate Indian conspiracies to attack them, but these lacked a French diplomatic dimension after 1763 or a Spanish connection after 1820. 41. Most of the frontiers experienced numerous conflicts. 42. The French and Indian War broke out between Britain and France, with the French making up for their small colonial population base by enlisting native war parties as allies. The series of large wars spilling over from European wars ended in a complete victory for the British in the worldwide 7 Years' War. In the Peace Treaty of 1763, France ceded practically everything, as the lands west of the Mississippi River, in addition to Florida and New Orleans, went to Spain. Otherwise, lands east of the Mississippi River and what is now Canada went to Britain. Citation needed. Study migration to frontier lands. Regardless of wars, Americans were moving across the Appalachians into western Pennsylvania, what is now West Virginia, and areas of the Ohio Country, Kentucky, and Tennessee. In the southern settlements via the Cumberland Gap, their most famous leader was Daniel Boone. 43. Young George Washington promoted settlements in western Virginia and what is now West Virginia on lands awarded to him and his soldiers by the royal government in payment for their wartime service in Virginia's militia. Settlements west of the Appalachian Mountains were curtailed briefly by the Royal Proclamation of 1763, forbidding settlement in this area. The Treaty of Fort Stanwix, 1768, reopened most of the western lands for frontiersmen to settle. 44. New nation. The nation was at peace after 1783. The states gave Congress control of the western lands and an effective system for population expansion was developed. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 abolished slavery in the area north of the Ohio River and promised statehood when a territory reached a threshold population, as Ohio did in 1803, 45-46. The first major movement west of the Appalachian Mountains originated in Pennsylvania, Virginia, and North Carolina as soon as the Revolutionary War ended in 1781. Pioneers housed themselves in a rough lean-to or at most a one-room log cabin. The main food supply at first came from hunting deer, turkeys, and other abundant game. Clad in typical frontier garb, leather breeches, moccasins, fur cap and hunting shirt, and girded by a belt from which hung a hunting knife and a shot pouch, all homemade, the pioneer presented a unique appearance. In a short time he opened in the woods a patch, or clearing, on which he grew corn, wheat, flax, tobacco, and other products, even fruit. 47. In a few years, the pioneer added hogs, sheep, and cattle, and perhaps acquired a horse. Homespun clothing replaced the animal skins. The more restless pioneers grew dissatisfied with over-civilized life and uprooted themselves again to move 50 or 100 miles, 80 or 160 kilometers, further west. Land policy. Map of the Wilderness Road by 1785. The land policy of the new nation was conservative, paying special attention to the needs of the settled East. 48. The goals sought by both parties in the 1790 to 1820 era were to grow the economy, avoid draining away the skilled workers needed in the East, distribute the land wisely, sell it at prices that were reasonable to settlers yet high enough to pay off the national debt, clear legal titles, and create a diversified Western economy that would be closely interconnected with the settled areas with minimal risk of a breakaway movement. By the 1830s, however, the West was filling up with squatters who had no legal deed, although they may have paid money to previous settlers. The Jacksonian Democrats favored the squatters by promising rapid access to cheap land. By contrast, Henry Clay was alarmed at the lawless rabble heading west who were undermining the utopian concept of a law-abiding, stable middle-class Republican community. Rich Southerners, meanwhile, looked for opportunities to buy high-quality land to set up slave plantations. The free soil movement of the 1840s called for low-cost land for free white farmers, a position enacted into law by the new Republican Party in 1862, offering free 160 acres, 65 hectares, homesteads to all adults, male and female, black and white, native-born or immigrant. 49. After winning the Revolutionary War, 1783, American settlers in large numbers poured into the West. In 1788, American pioneers to the Northwest Territory established Marietta, Ohio, as the first permanent American settlement in the Northwest Territory. 50. In 1775, Daniel Boone blazed a trail for the Transylvania Company from Virginia through the Cumberland Gap into central Kentucky. It was later lengthened to reach the Falls of the Ohio at Louisville. The Wilderness Road was steep and rough, and it could only be traversed on foot or horseback, but it was the best route for thousands of settlers moving into Kentucky. 51. In some areas they had to face native attacks. In 1784 alone, natives killed over 100 travelers on the Wilderness Road. Kentucky at this time had been depopulated, it was empty of Indian villages. 52. However, raiding parties sometimes came through. One of those intercepted was Abraham Lincoln's grandfather, who was scalped in 1784 near Louisville. 53. Acquisition of native lands. Native leader Tecumseh killed in battle in 1813 by Richard M. Johnson, who later became vice president. The War of 1812 marked the final confrontation involving major British and native forces fighting to stop American expansion. The British war goal included the creation of an Indian barrier state under British auspices in the Midwest, which would halt American expansion westward. American frontier militiamen under General Andrew Jackson defeated the Creeks and opened the Southwest, while militia under Governor William Henry Harrison defeated the native British alliance at the Battle of the Thames in Canada in 1813. The death in battle of the native leader Tecumseh dissolved the coalition of hostile native tribes. 54. Meanwhile, General Andrew Jackson ended the native military threat in the Southeast at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in 1814 in Alabama. In general, the frontiersmen battled the natives with little help from the U.S. Army or the federal government. 55. To end the war, American diplomats negotiated the Treaty of Ghent, signed towards the end of 1814, with Britain. They rejected the British plan to set up a native state in U.S. territory south of the Great Lakes. They explained the American policy toward the acquisition of native lands. The United States, while intending never to acquire lands from the Indians otherwise than peaceably, and with their free consent, are fully determined, in that manner, progressively and in proportion as their growing population may require, to reclaim from the state of nature, and to bring into cultivation every portion of the territory contained within their acknowledged boundaries. In thus providing for the support of millions of civilized beings, they will not violate any dictate of justice or humanity, for they will not only give to the few thousand savages scattered over that territory an ample equivalent for any right they may surrender, but will always leave them the possession of lands more than they can cultivate and more than adequate to their subsistence, comfort, and enjoyment by cultivation. If this is a spirit of aggrandizement, the undersigned are prepared to admit, in that sense, its existence, but they must deny that it affords the slightest proof of an intention not to respect the boundaries between them and European nations, or of a desire to encroach upon the territories of Great Britain. They will not suppose that that government will avow, as the basis of their policy towards the United States, a system of arresting their natural growth within their territories, for the sake of preserving a perpetual desert for savages. 56. New territories and states. Thomas Jefferson saw himself as a man of the frontier and a scientist. He was keenly interested in expanding and exploring the West. As settlers poured in, the frontier districts first became territories, with an elected legislature and a governor appointed by the president. Then, when the population reached 100,000, the territory applied for statehood. 57. Frontiersmen typically dropped the legalistic formalities and restrictive franchise favored by Eastern upper classes and adopting more democracy and more egalitarianism. 58. In 1810, the western frontier had reached the Mississippi River. St. Louis, Missouri, was the largest town on the frontier, the gateway for travel westward, and a principal trading center for Mississippi River traffic and inland commerce, but remained under Spanish control until 1803. Thomas Jefferson thought of himself as a man of the frontier and was keenly interested in expanding and exploring the West. 59. Jefferson's Louisiana Purchase of 1803 doubled the size of the nation at the cost of $15 million, or about 4 cents per acre, $315 million in 2024 dollars, less than 42 cents per acre. 60. Federalists opposed the expansion, but Jeffersonians hailed the opportunity to create millions of new farms to expand the domain of landowning yeomen. The ownership would strengthen the ideal Republican society, based on agriculture, not commerce, govern lightly, and promoting self-reliance and virtue, as well as form the political base for Jeffersonian democracy. France was paid for its sovereignty over the territory in terms of international law. Between 1803 and the 1870s, the federal government purchased the land from the native tribes then in possession of it. 20th century accountants and courts have calculated the value of the payments made to the natives, which included future payments of cash, food, horses, cattle, supplies, buildings, schooling, and medical care. In cash terms, the total paid to the tribes in the area of the Louisiana Purchase amounted to about $2.6 billion, or nearly $9 billion in 2016 dollars. Additional sums were paid to the natives living east of the Mississippi for their lands, as well as payments to natives living in parts of the West outside the Louisiana Purchase. 62. Even before the purchase, Jefferson was planning expeditions to explore and map the lands. He charged Lewis and Clark to explore the Missouri River and such principal stream of it as, by its course and communication with the waters of the Pacific Ocean, whether the Columbia, Oregon, Colorado, or any other river may offer the most direct and practicable communication across the continent for commerce. 63. Jefferson also instructed the expedition to study the region's native tribes, including their morals, language, and culture, weather, soil, rivers, commercial trading, and animal and plant life. 64. Entrepreneurs, most notably John Jacob Astor, quickly seized the opportunity and expanded for trading operations into the Pacific Northwest. Astor's Fort Astoria, later Fort George, at the mouth of the Columbia River, became the first permanent white settlement in that area, although it was not profitable for Astor. He set up the American Fur Company in an attempt to break the hold that the Hudson's Bay Company monopoly had over the region. By 1820, Astor had taken over independent traders to create a profitable monopoly. He left the business as a multi-millionaire in 1834. As the frontier moved west, trappers and hunters moved ahead of settlers, searching out new supplies of beaver and other skins for shipment to Europe. The hunters were the first Europeans in much of the Old West, and they formed the first working relationships with the Native Americans in the West. 66-67. They added extensive knowledge of the Northwest terrain, including the important South Pass through the central Rocky Mountains. Discovered about 1812, it later became a major route for settlers to Oregon and Washington. By 1820, however, a new brigade rendezvous system sent company men in brigades cross-country on long expeditions, bypassing many tribes. It also encouraged free trappers to explore new regions on their own. At the end of the gathering season, the trappers would rendezvous and turn in their goods for pay at river ports along the Green River, Upper Missouri, and the Upper Mississippi. St. Louis was the largest of the rendezvous towns. By 1830, however, fashions changed and beaver huts were replaced by silk huts, ending the demand for expensive American furs. Thus ended the era of the mountain men, trappers, and scouts such as Jedediah Smith, Hugh Glass, Davy Crockett, Jack Omohundro, and others. The trade in beaver fur virtually ceased by 1845-68. The federal government and westward expansion. There was wide agreement on the need to settle the new territories quickly, but the debate polarized over the price the government should charge. The conservatives and Whigs, typified by the President John Quincy Adams, wanted a moderated pace that charged the newcomers enough to pay the costs of the federal government. The Democrats, however, tolerated a wild scramble for land at very low prices. The final resolution came in the Homestead Law of 1862, with a moderated pace that gave settlers 160 acres free after they worked on it for 5 years. 69. The private profit motive dominated the movement westward. 70, but the federal government played a supporting role in securing the land through treaties and setting up territorial governments, with governors appointed by the president. The federal government first acquired Western territory through treaties with other nations or native tribes. Then it sent surveyors to map and document the land. 71. By the 20th century, Washington bureaucracies managed the federal lands such as the United States General Land Office in the Interior Department. 72. And after 1891, the Forest Service in the Department of Agriculture. 73. After 1900, dam building and flood control became major concerns. 74. Transportation was a key issue, and the Army, especially the Army Corps of Engineers, was given full responsibility for facilitating navigation on the rivers. The steamboat, first used on the Ohio River in 1811, made possible inexpensive travel using the river systems, especially the Mississippi and Missouri rivers and their tributaries. 75. Army expeditions up the Missouri River in 1818 to 1825 allowed engineers to improve the technology. For example, the Army steamboat Western Engineer of 1819 combined a very shallow draft with one of the earliest stern wheels. In 1819 to 1825, Colonel Henry Atkinson developed keelboats with hand-powered paddle wheels. 76. The federal postal system played a crucial role in national expansion. It facilitated expansion into the West by creating an inexpensive, fast, convenient communication system. Letters from early settlers provided information and boosterism to encourage increased migration to the West, helped scattered families stay in touch, and provide neutral help, assisted entrepreneurs to find business opportunities, and made possible regular commercial relationships between merchants and the West and wholesalers and factories back east. The Postal Service likewise assisted the Army in expanding control over the vast Western territories. The widespread circulation of important newspapers by mail, such as the New York Weekly Tribune, facilitated coordination among politicians in different states. The Postal Service helped to integrate already established areas with the frontier, creating a spirit of nationalism and providing a necessary infrastructure. 77. The Army early on assumed the mission of protecting settlers along with the westward expansion trails, a policy that was described by U.S. Secretary of War John B. Floyd in 1857. Frowny face 78. A line of posts running parallel without frontier, but near to the Indians' usual habitations, placed at convenient distances and suitable positions, and occupied by infantry, would exercise a salutary restraint upon the tribes, who would feel that any foray by their warriors upon the white settlements would meet with prompt retaliation upon their own homes. There was a debate at the time about the best size for the forts, with Jefferson Davis, Winfield Scott, and Thomas Jessup supporting forts that were larger but fewer in number than Floyd. Floyd's plan was more expensive, but had the support of settlers and the general public, who preferred that the military remain as close as possible. The frontier area was vast, and even Davis conceded that concentration would have exposed portions of the frontier to native hostilities without any protection. 78. Scientists, artists, and explorers. The first Fort Laramie as it looked before 1840. Painting from memory by Alfred Jacob Miller. Government and private enterprise sent many explorers to the west. In 1805 to 1806, Army Lieutenant Zebulon Pike, 1779 to 1813, led a party of 20 soldiers to find the headwaters of the Mississippi. He later explored the Red and Arkansas rivers in Spanish territory, eventually reaching the Rio Grande. On his return, Pike sighted the peak in Colorado named after him. 79. Major Stephen Harriman Long, 1784 to 1864, 80, led the Yellowstone and Missouri expeditions of 1819 to 1820, but his categorizing in 1823 of the Great Plains as arid and useless led to the region getting a bad reputation as the Great American Desert, which discouraged settlement in that area for several decades. 81. In 1811, naturalists Thomas Nuttall, 1786 to 1859, and John Bradbury, 1768 to 1823, traveled up the Missouri River documenting and drawing plant and animal life. 82. Artist George Catlin, 1796 to 1872, painted accurate paintings of Native American culture. Swiss artist Karl Bodmer made compelling landscapes and portraits. 83. John James Audubon, 1785 to 1851, is famous for classifying and painting in minute details 500 species of birds, published in Birds of America. 84. The most famous of the explorers was John Charles Fremont, 1813 to 1890, an Army officer in the Corps of Topographical Engineers. He displayed a talent for exploration and a genius at self-promotion that gave him the sobriquet of Pathmarker of the West and led him to the presidential nomination of the new Republican Party in 1856. 85. He led a series of expeditions in the 1840s, which answered many of the outstanding geographic questions about the little-known region. He crossed through the Rocky Mountains by 5 different routes and mapped parts of Oregon and California. In 1846 to 1847, he played a role in conquering California. In 1848 to 1849, Fremont was assigned to locate a central route through the mountains for the proposed Transcontinental Railroad, but his expedition ended in near disaster when it became lost and was trapped by heavy snow. 86. His reports, mixed narrative of exciting adventure with scientific data and detailed practical information for travelers. It caught the public imagination and inspired many to head west. Goetzman says it was monumental in its breadth, a classic of exploring literature. 87. While colleges were springing up across the Northeast, there was little competition on the western frontier for Transylvania University, founded in Lexington, Kentucky, in 1780. It boasted of a law school in addition to its undergraduate and medical programs. Transylvania attracted politically ambitious young men from across the Southwest, including 50 who became United States senators, 101 representatives, 36 governors, and 34 ambassadors, as well as Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederacy, 88. Mexico and Texas. Main articles: History of Mexico and Texas Revolution. Sam Houston accepting the surrender of Mexican General Santa Anna, 1836. Mexico became independent of Spain in 1821 and took over Spain's northern possessions stretching from Texas to California. American caravans began delivering goods to the Mexican city Santa Fe along the Santa Fe Trail, over the 870-mile, 1,400 kilometers, journey which took 48 days from Kansas City, Missouri, then known as Westport. Santa Fe was also the trailhead for the El Camino Real, the King's Highway, a trade route which carried American manufactured goods southward deep into Mexico and returned silver, furs, and mules northward, not to be confused with another Camino Real, which connected the missions in California. A branch also ran eastward near the Gulf, also called the Old San Antonio Road. Santa Fe connected to California via the Old Spanish Trail, 103. 104. The Spanish and Mexican governments attracted American settlers to Texas with generous terms. Stephen F. Austin became an impresario, receiving contracts from the Mexican officials to bring in immigrants. In doing so, he also became the de facto political and military commander of the area. Tensions rose, however, after an abortive attempt to establish the independent nation of Fredonia in 1826. William Travis, leading the War Party, advocated for independence from Mexico, while the Peace Party, led by Austin, attempted to get more autonomy within the current relationship. When Mexican President Santa Anna shifted alliances and joined the conservative Centralist Party, he declared himself dictator and ordered soldiers into Texas to curtail new immigration and unrest. However, immigration continued and 30,000 Anglos with 3,000 slaves were settled in Texas by 1835. 105. In 1836, the Texas Revolution erupted. Following losses at the Alamo and Goliad, the Texians won the decisive Battle of San Jacinto to secure independence. At San Jacinto, Sam Houston, commander-in-chief of the Texian Army and future president of the Republic of Texas, famously shouted, "Remember the Alamo. Remember Goliad." The U.S. Congress declined to annex Texas, stalemated by contentious arguments over slavery and regional power. Thus, the Republic of Texas remained an independent power for nearly a decade before it was annexed as the 28th state in 1845. The government of Mexico, however, viewed Texas as a runaway province and asserted its ownership. Mexico refused to recognize the independence of Texas in 1836, but the U.S. and European powers did so. Mexico threatened war if Texas joined the U.S., which it did in 1845. American negotiators were turned away by a Mexican government in turmoil. When the Mexican army killed 16 American soldiers in disputed territory, war was at hand. Whigs such as Congressman Abraham Lincoln denounced the war, but it was quite popular outside New England. 107. The Mexican strategy was defensive. The American strategy was a three-pronged offensive, using large numbers of volunteer soldiers. 108. Overland forces seized New Mexico with little resistance and headed to California, which quickly fell to the American land and naval forces. From the main American base at New Orleans, General Zachary Taylor led forces into northern Mexico, winning a series of battles that ensued. The U.S. Navy transported General Winfield Scott to Veracruz. He then marched his 12,000-man force west to Mexico City, winning the final battle at Chapultepec. Talk of acquiring all of Mexico fell away when the Army discovered the Mexican political and cultural values were so alien to America's. As the Cincinnati Herald asked, what would the U.S. do with 8 million Mexicans, with their idol worship, heathen superstition, and degraded mongrel races? 109. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo of 1848 ceded the territories of California and New Mexico to the United States for $18.5 million, which included the assumption of claims against Mexico by settlers. The Gadsden Purchase in 1853 added southern Arizona, which was needed for a railroad route to California. In all, Mexico ceded 500,000 square miles, 1.3 million square kilometers, and included the states to be of California, Utah, Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming, in addition to Texas. Managing the new territories and dealing with the slavery issue caused intense controversy, particularly over the Wilmot Proviso, which would have outlawed slavery in the new territories. Congress never passed it, but rather temporarily resolved the issue of slavery in the West with the Compromise of 1850. California entered the Union in 1850 as a free state. The other areas remained territories for many years. 110, 111. Growth of Texas. The new state grew rapidly as migrants poured into the fertile cotton lands of East Texas. 112. German immigrants started to arrive in the early 1840s because of negative economic, social, and political pressures in Germany. 113. With their investments in cotton lands and slaves, planters established cotton plantations in the eastern districts. The central area of the state was developed more by subsistence farmers who seldom owned slaves. 114. Texas in its Wild West days attracted men who could shoot straight and possessed the zest for adventure, for masculine renown, patriotic service, martial glory, and meaningful deaths. 115. California Gold Rush. Main article: California Gold Rush. Clipper ships took 5 months to sail the 17,000 miles, 27,000 kilometers, from New York City to San Francisco. San Francisco Harbor C, 1850. Between 1847 and 1870, the population of San Francisco exploded from 500 to 150,000. In 1846, about 10,000 Californios, Hispanics, lived in California, primarily on cattle ranches in what is now the Los Angeles area. A few hundred foreigners were scattered in the northern districts, including some Americans. With the outbreak of war with Mexico in 1846, the U.S. sent in Fremont and a U.S. Army unit, as well as naval forces, and quickly took control. 116. As the war was ending, gold was discovered in the north, and the word soon spread worldwide. Thousands of 49ers reached California by sailing around South America, or taking a shortcut through disease-ridden Panama, or walked the California Trail. The population soared to over 200,000 in 1852, mostly in the gold districts that stretched into the mountains east of San Francisco. Housing in San Francisco was at a premium, and abandoned ships whose crews had headed for the mines were often converted to temporary lodging. In the gold fields themselves, living conditions were primitive, though the mild climate proved attractive. Supplies were expensive and food poor, typical diets consisting mostly of pork, beans, and whiskey. These highly male, transient communities with no established institutions were prone to high levels of violence, drunkenness, profanity, and greed-driven behavior. Without courts or law officers in the mining communities to enforce claims and justice, miners developed their ad hoc legal system, based on the mining codes used in other mining communities abroad. Each camp had its own rules and often handed out justice by popular vote, sometimes acting fairly and at times exercising vigilantes, with Native Americans, Indians, Mexicans, and Chinese generally receiving the harshest sentences. 117. The gold rush radically changed the California economy and brought in an array of professionals, including precious metal specialists, merchants, doctors, and attorneys, who added to the population of miners, saloon keepers, gamblers, and prostitutes. A San Francisco newspaper stated, "The whole country resounds to the sordid cry of gold. 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 While the field is left half planted, the house half built, and everything neglected, but the manufacture of shovels and pickaxes." 118. Over 250,000 miners found a total of more than $200 million in gold in the 5 years of the California Gold Rush. 119. 120. As thousands arrived, however, fewer and fewer miners struck their fortune, and most ended exhausted and broke. Violent bandits often preyed upon the miners, such as the case of Jonathan R. Davis's killing of 11 bandits single-handedly. 121. camps spread out north and south of the American River and eastward into the Sierras. In a few years, nearly all of the independent miners were displaced as mines were purchased and run by mining companies, who then hired low-paid salaried miners. As gold became harder to find and more difficult to extract, individual prospectors gave way to paid work gangs, specialized skills, and mining machinery. Bigger mines, however, caused greater environmental damage. In the mountains, shaft mining predominated, producing large amounts of waste. Beginning in 1852, at the end of the '49 gold rush, through 1883, hydraulic mining was used. Despite huge profits being made, it fell into the hands of a few capitalists, displaced numerous miners, vast amounts of waste entered river systems, and did heavy ecological damage to the environment. Hydraulic mining ended when the public outcry over the destruction of farmlands led to the outlawing of this practice. 122. The mountainous areas of the Triangle from New Mexico to California to South Dakota contained hundreds of hard rock mining sites, where prospectors discovered gold, silver, copper, and other minerals, as well as some soft rock coal. Temporary mining camps sprang up overnight. Most became ghost towns when the ores were depleted. Prospectors spread out and hunted for gold and silver along the Rockies and in the Southwest. Soon gold was discovered in Colorado, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, Idaho, Montana, and South Dakota by 1864. 123. The discovery of the Comstock lode, containing vast amounts of silver, resulted in the Nevada boomtowns of Virginia City, Carson City, and Silver City. The wealth from silver, more than from gold, fueled the maturation of San Francisco in the 1860s and helped the rise of some of its wealthiest families, such as that of George Hearst. 124. Oregon Trail. Main article: Oregon Trail. 400,000 men, women, and children traveled 2,000 miles, 3,200 kilometers, in wagon trains during a 6-month journey on the Oregon Trail. To get to the rich new lands of the West Coast, there were 3 auctions. Some sailed around the southern tip of South America during a 6-month voyage, some took the treacherous journey across the Panama Isthmus. But 400,000 others walked there on an overland route of more than 2,000 miles, 3,200 kilometers. Their wagon trains usually left from Missouri. They moved in large groups under an experienced wagon master, bringing their clothing, farm supplies, weapons, and animals. These wagon trains followed major rivers, crossed prairies and mountains, and typically ended in Oregon and California. Pioneers generally attempted to complete the journey during a single warm season, usually for 6 months. By 1836, when the first migrant wagon train was organized in Independence, Missouri, a wagon trail had been cleared to Fort Hall, Idaho. Trails were cleared further and further west, eventually reaching the Willamette Valley in Oregon. This network of wagon trails leading to the Pacific Northwest was later called the Oregon Trail. The eastern half of the route was also used by travelers on the California Trail, from 1843, Mormon Trail, from 1847, and Bozeman Trail, from 1863, before they turned off to their separate destinations. 125. In the wagon train of 1843, some 700 to 1,000 emigrants headed for Oregon. Missionary Marcus Whitman led the wagons on the last leg. In 1846, the Barlow Road was completed around Mount Hood, providing a rough but passable wagon trail from the Missouri River to the Willamette Valley, about 2,000 miles, 3,200 kilometers. 126. Though the main direction of travel on the early wagon trails was westward, people also used the Oregon Trail to travel eastward. Some did so because they were discouraged and defeated. Some returned with bags of gold and silver. Most were returning to pick up their families and move them all back west. These go-backs were a major source of information and excitement about the wonders and promises and dangers and disappointments of the far west. 127. Not all emigrants made it to their destination. The dangers of the overland route were numerous: snake bites, wagon accidents, violence from other travelers, suicide, malnutrition, stampedes, native attacks, a variety of diseases, dysentery, typhoid, and cholera were among the most common. Exposure, avalanches, etc. One particularly well-known example of the treacherous nature of the journey is the story of the ill-fated Donner Party, which became trapped in the Sierra Nevada mountains during the winter of 1846 to 1847. Half of the 90 people traveling with the group died from starvation and exposure, and some resorted to cannibalism to survive. 128. Another story of cannibalism featured Alfred Packer and his trek to Colorado in 1874. There were also frequent attacks from bandits and highwaymen, such as the infamous Harp brothers who patrolled the frontier routes and targeted migrant groups. 129. 130. Mormons and Utah. Main articles: 1838 Mormon War and Utah War. The Mountain Meadows Massacre was conducted by Mormons and Paiute natives against 120 civilians bound for California. The Handcart Pioneer Monument, by Torleaf S. Nafus, located on Temple Square in Salt Lake City, Utah. In Missouri and Illinois, animosity between the Mormon settlers and locals grew, which would mirror those in other states, such as Utah years later. Violence finally erupted on October 24, 1838, when militias from both sides clashed and a mass killing of Mormons in Livingston County occurred 6 days later. 131. A Mormon extermination order was filed during these conflicts, and the Mormons were forced to scatter. 132. Brigham Young, seeking to leave American jurisdiction to escape religious persecution in Illinois and Missouri, led the Mormons to the Valley of the Great Salt Lake, owned at the time by Mexico, but not controlled by them. 100 rural Mormon settlements sprang up in what Young called Deseret, which he ruled as a theocracy. It later became Utah Territory. Young's Salt Lake City settlement served as the hub of their network, which reached into neighboring territories as well. The communalism and advanced farming practices of the Mormons enabled them to succeed. 133. The Mormons often sold goods to wagon trains passing through. After the battle at Fort Utah in 1850, Brigham Young began to articulate an Indian policy often paraphrased as "it is cheaper to feed them than to fight them." 134. However, Wakara's War and Utah's Black Hawk War demonstrate that hostilities persisted until federal and territorial leaders came to agree that the nearby indigenous people should all be displaced to the Uinta Reservation. 135. Education became a high priority to protect the beleaguered group, reduce heresy, and maintain group solidarity. 136. Following the end of the Mexican-American War in 1848, Utah was ceded to the United States by Mexico. Though the Mormons in Utah had supported U.S. efforts during the war, the federal government, pushed by the Protestant churches, rejected theocracy and polygamy. Founded in 1852, the Republican Party was openly hostile towards the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, LDS Church, in Utah over the practice of polygamy, viewed by most of the American public as an affront to religious, cultural, and moral values of modern civilization. Confrontations verged on open warfare in the late 1850s as President Buchanan sent in troops. Although there were no military battles fought and negotiations led to a stand-down, violence still escalated and there were several casualties. 137. After the Civil War, the federal government systematically took control of Utah. The LDS Church was legally disincorporated in the territory, and members of the church's hierarchy, including Young, were summarily removed and barred from virtually every public office. 138. Meanwhile, successful missionary work in the U.S. and Europe brought a flood of Mormon converts to Utah. During this time, Congress refused to admit Utah into the Union as a state, and statehood would mean an end to direct federal control over the territory and the possible ascension of politicians chosen and controlled by the LDS Church into most, if not all, federal, state, and local elected offices from the new state. Finally, in 1890, the church leadership announced polygamy was no longer a central tenet, thereafter a compromise. In 1896, Utah was admitted as the 45th state, with the Mormons dividing between Republicans and Democrats. 139. Pony Express and the Telegraph. Main article: Pony Express. Map of Pony Express route. The federal government provided subsidies for the development of mail and freight delivery, and by 1856, Congress authorized road improvements and an overland mail service to California. The new commercial wagon train service primarily hauled freight. In 1858, John Butterfield, 1801 to 1869, established a stage service that went from St. Louis to San Francisco in 24 days along a southern route. This route was abandoned in 1861 after Texas joined the Confederacy, in favor of stagecoach services established via Fort Laramie and Salt Lake City, a 24-day journey, with Wells Fargo and Company as the foremost provider, initially using the old Butterfield name. 140. William Russell, hoping to get a government contract for more rapid mail delivery service, started the Pony Express in 1860, cutting delivery time to 10 days. He set up over 150 stations about 15 miles, 24 kilometers, apart. In 1861, Congress passed the Land-Grant Telegraph Act, which financed the construction of Western Union's transcontinental telegraph lines. Hiram Sibley, Western Union's head, negotiated exclusive agreements with railroads to run telegraph lines along their right-of-way. 8 years before the Transcontinental Railroad opened, the first transcontinental telegraph linked Omaha, Nebraska, to San Francisco on October 24, 1861. 141. The Pony Express ended in just 18 months because it could not compete with the telegraph.